All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Suzanne Singer. I'm the Executive Director of the Sunshine Coast Conservation Association. On behalf of the SCCA, Rhizome Up Media, and the Green Film Series, I want to welcome you all to our annual Sunshine Coast World Oceans Day Festival and the first of our 2023 Nemo Talk series. The SCCA's mandate is to protect biodiversity in the Sunshine Coast Natural Resource District. These lands and waters are within the territories of the Squamish, Shishal, Swiamin, Klahoose, and Homolko First Nations. I'm zooming in today from Checkwelp, or Gibsons, at Catsum Howe Sound. The SCCA is so grateful to the First Nations of this region for stewarding these lands and waters from time immemorial. We deeply respect the reverence that Indigenous peoples have always had for nature and their ancestral and eternal connection with it. It's in this spirit of connection between all life on our planet that we bring you our World Oceans Day Festival. Also, just a bit about World Oceans Day. Every year on June 8th, people all around the world come together to celebrate this day. And it was designated by the UN to help inform the global public of the impact of human actions on our oceans, develop a worldwide movement of citizens working for the ocean, and mobilize and unite the global population to support sustainable management of our oceans. This year's theme for the World Oceans Day is Planet Ocean, Tides Are Changing. As our planet and our waters warm and seas rise, we must join forces to tackle these challenges ahead together. This year's festival program includes thought-provoking and inspiring feature films, our Nemo Talk series, and interactive activities, all geared toward inspiring, enlisting, and connecting you and everyone on the Sunshine Coast and beyond to work together to take action to tackle these challenges. For our first talk this year, we are really excited to take a deeper dive into the lives of Salish Sea cetaceans with Gary Sutton of OceanWise. Angela, I'm going to pass it over to you to introduce Gary.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. So OceanWise has been an ocean champion for 50 years. They started from humble beginnings in Vancouver in 1951. They have grown into a global environmental charity that addresses multiple facets of ocean conservation. Their whales team specifically focuses on public outreach, contaminants, and health monitoring. So Gary Sutton has been working with the whales since 2007. He joined OceanWise's whale body condition and health monitoring team in 2021 as a research technician and a photo identification specialist. Prior to joining the team, he spent 5 years with Bay Cetology's killer whales monitoring team, where he helped identify and track the population of mammal-eating Bigg's killer whales in British Columbia. Outside of research, Gary also works as a wildlife guide and photographer, and these passions have led him to photograph wildlife, mainly cetaceans, which include whales, dolphins, and porpoises, globally, including across British Columbia, Hawaii, and New Zealand. His photographs have been used in numerous publications, even featured in Canadian Geographic and National Geographic. Thank you, Gary, for joining us today. I'm so excited to hear what OceanWise has been up to and what some of the new projects might be in the horizon. Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thanks so much for having me and for the wonderful introduction, Suzanne and Angela, for putting this on. And thank you everyone for coming and listening to me speak today a little bit about our work. I'm just going to share my screen here and get the presentation going and make sure you guys can all see it. Can everybody see that okay? Okay, perfect. Okay, so like the introduction there, you guys can probably tell I'm a bit of a whale nerd, and I love to spend as much time as I possibly can on the water in the presence of these incredible animals that we get to share our home with. So you'll mostly find me working on this boat. This is my home away from home. This is our research vessel with OceanWise called Scanna. And this is where I am most summers and even now in the winter times, which will be, if you do see me out there, it'll most likely be in the winter, which I'll talk a little bit more about shortly. But before I get into our work specifically with Oceanwise and the kind of work that we're doing and have done, I kind of wanted to give a brief history of whales in the area because it's such a unique history and a pretty special place to talk about killer whales and other species as well. So I'll kind of start with, for me and a lot of my generation growing up, when I thought killer whale, the first image that conjured up in my mind was the shot of Willie jumping over that wall in the 1993 blockbuster Free Willy, which really solidified the adoration for killer whales, not just in British Columbia, but globally. But it's important to remember our past as well, which is prior to this film coming out. The world for killer whales was much different, even 30 years prior. It was very different 30 years prior. The global perception of the species was more along the lines of this movie title, Orca, the killer whale, which some of you might remember. These animals were not very liked. They were considered competition for food. They were considered to be very dangerous animals, and there was a good chance they'd try to attack you if you got near them. I mean, today we all know that sounds ludicrous, but that was the public perception of killer whales. And even in British Columbia, there was government law to shoot them. And some of you might know of a little pass just north of Campbell River called Seymour Narrows. There was actually a government mounted machine gun planted there to shoot killer whales as they came through the narrows there. It was never fired, but the fact that it was there kind of gives you an idea of what a different world it was for these killer whales back then. So how did that change? It started in July of 1964, and it was kind of inadvertent. What had happened was the Vancouver Aquarium at the time decided they wanted to build a sculpture of the killer whale, and they thought the best way to do it would be to come out and kill an actual killer whale so they could use it as a basis for their sculpture. And I know that sounds kind of crazy, but again, keep in mind back then it was a different world. It was law to shoot them, so it was no big deal. So the curator of the aquarium at the time, Dr. Murray Newman, commissioned someone to do this. And back then, this whole area, the Salish Sea, was mostly utilized by southern resident killer whales. It was very rare that we saw other types of killer whales here back then, and humpbacks as well. So if you do know the southern residents at all, one thing you know about them is they travel in fairly large groups, and they're fairly predictable. At least they used to be, especially in the summer months, as far as their travel patterns go throughout the Salish Sea. And the person that was commissioned to collect one of these whales, he noted that one of the places that the whales often come close to shore, which they still do today, they actually just did this morning, is a place called East Point on Saturna Island, where they come right along the shoreline as they're heading up into the Strait of Georgia or on their way back down. And so in July of '64, he set up his harpoon base there. He waited for 3 weeks, and then finally, when the whales came close enough, he was able to harpoon one of these animals. And what he saw next was its family members came up to it and started holding it above the surface. So he immediately realized that this animal wasn't exactly what we think it is. And he called the curator of the aquarium, like I mentioned, Murray Newman, and they both decided to try to bring this whale back to Vancouver alive. And they towed it all the way across the Strait of Georgia, right to downtown Vancouver by the harpoon, by the way, which is crazy that it survived the journey. And he became the first successful semi-captive killer whale in history. And through a radio contest, he got the nickname Moby Doll. Now, at this time, we didn't know anything about killer whales. They were trying to feed him chicken and beef and all kinds of weird stuff. Sooner or later, they figured out he liked fish. Surprise, surprise. And you can see in the top left corner there, just in Jericho Beach, a bunch of people gathered around Moby. This is kind of how it started, but as the people working with him got more comfortable and started to hand feed him and touch him, the story kind of blew up, not just nationally, but internationally. And people started coming in from all over the world to come see Moby Doll right in the Vancouver harbor. Now, killer whale husbandry wasn't where it is today. So unfortunately, Moby Doll only survived 3 months before dying of a skin infection, but it's a real testament to how incredible the species is that in 3 months, the entire global perception of killer whales kind of flipped, which was really great, obviously, because it led to lots of great scientists coming down the pipe into where we are today, having a deep respect for the species. But in the short term, it wasn't really a great thing for the whales because the lights above the heads of aquarium owners from all over the world realized how many people were coming to see Moby Doll. And they realized that if they had one in their facility, how much money they could make. And again, like I mentioned with the southern residents, one thing we know about them is they travel in very large groups. So back in those days, you could come out and they'd be here almost every day through the spring, summer, and fall. So you could see 50 to 100 killer whales daily. So it was easy to extrapolate and say, oh, we must have thousands of them. Why don't we just go out and catch a few? And so that's when the capture era really started. And the southern residents were targeted heavily during that time. This is one of the last captures here on August 8th, 1970, down in Puget Sound. And we know now about 50 whales roughly were taken from the population, and they were targeting young animals between the ages of 1 and 5 because they would last longer in captivity and they were easier to transport. So, and we know now that represented about a third of the entire population. So, you know, today when we talk about conservation issues for southern resident killer whales, the main focal point is often vessel disturbance and lack of food and contaminants, which are all serious issues. But, you know, the real uphill battle for this population really started when so much of their population was removed for the aquarium trade and left them sort of in this genetic bottleneck that they're still trying to recover from. And obviously all those other issues, like I mentioned, are amplifying that issue. They weren't the only ones that were targeted. I chose this picture here because you guys living on the Sunshine Coast have probably been treated, or at least some of you, to see northern resident killer whales, particularly in the winter. Typical range for the northern resident killer whales is Campbell River all the way up to Alaska. So coming down into the Salish Sea is very rare. However, there is one clan known as the A5s that in the wintertime will come down along the Sunshine Coast and into the Bowen Island area, up into Howe Sound. And today, most of the sightings that you'll see there are the A42s natural line, which are part of the A5 clan. So this particular whale, her name is Corky, and she lives at SeaWorld San Diego. She was captured right there on the Sunshine Coast in December of 1969 in Pender Harbor, and she still lives there today. So they weren't targeted as heavily as the southern residents, but certainly impacted a little bit as well. And then finally, Bigg's killer whales, or what we used to call transients. Again, back then, we didn't know that there were all these different types of killer whales. We just thought the killer whale was a killer whale. So most of the time when they captured these Bigg's killer whales, most of them didn't take the fish they were being offered, so they perished. Some of them, like these ones, were lucky enough. This was the last capture in Puget Sound in 1976. They were known as the Bud Inlet 6, as these 6 killer whales were captured and being held in a semi-captive environment, being ready to be sold to marine parks across the world. But by this time, the perception of killer whales in captivity and people seeing it, especially in the area, it was quite a horrific scene, you know, using underwater explosives to herd them into bays and, you know, the panic amongst the pod. So people started to fight to see the end of this trade. And in 1976, in the Bud Inlet area, there was a group of citizens, that some of them being lawyers, who actually got together and started to work to fight for the freedom of these whales. And I'm happy to report they were successful. And these 6 whales were ordered to be released and they were sent back into the wild. And the reason why I bring this story up in particular is because one of those whales that was released is one that we see in the Salish Sea here quite frequently, even today. And her name is T46, or her nickname is Wake. This is her in the foreground here. And since her release, the calves that she's had and the calves that they've had, she has produced 21 additional wild killer whales in the population since that release. So when we go back to the slide a couple slides ago, when I talked about the southern residents and how 50 of them were taken from the population, it really kind of puts into perspective the kind of impact that had on the population. So it wasn't just out of the goodness of our hearts that we decided to stop capturing them. Fisheries and Oceans Canada decided we need to figure out how many killer whales we have so they can set a proper quota for how many can be captured. So they hired a fisheries biologist from right here where I am in the Cowichan Valley, and his name was Dr. Michael Bigg. And he started the first killer whale photo identification program. He realized by taking these lateral shots of the animals and looking at their fins and the saddle patch, which is that little white patch below the dorsal fin, he could tell the difference between all these unique individuals. And that's when he realized that there was a lot of repeat animals being seen the same day, and that the population was actually quite small and finite. And he continued working on this up until 1990. His life was cut short, unfortunately, due to cancer, but there were so many good scientists that followed in his footsteps, and it's led to the most comprehensive killer whale database on the planet. So virtually everything we learned about killer whales is from our whales right here, and it all started with this man here, which is why today we don't call them transients anymore. Mike Bigg, when he first started seeing these animals, like I mentioned earlier, it was resident killer whales that were dominant in the area. There wasn't very many transients, and we'll talk about why shortly, but that's why he called them transient, because they were so infrequent. And now we know that's a misleading name because they are truly the new residents. So we now call them Bigg's killer whales in memory of Michael Bigg. And his work is one that I consider to be very lucky to work on the project that he started. And it's done very much the same way, the painstaking process of going through frame by frame images and trying to figure out who each whale is. And it's a little more digital these days, obviously, but virtually the same methods. But we do have some big changes coming soon, which if you're more interested about that, you can we can talk about that later. But it's a new web-based platform that'll be launching hopefully in the next month or so called FinWave. And it'll be a way, it's basically going to make all of the data set open access to everybody. So you can go on this web-based platform and see the whole life history of the animals, their travel patterns around the coast, and will allow you as a citizens to submit data as well to the program and allow everyone to interact with it more freely. So like I mentioned now, we do know a lot more about killer whales, especially since Mike's passing. We've learned so much more, and we know we have different ecotypes that live here in British Columbia. We have 3 distinct ecotypes, the resident killer whales, Bigg's killer whales, and then offshores, which you can probably guess by their name. We don't see them too much. But all these killer whales are all genetically and culturally distinct from one another, and there's no interbreeding amongst those groups, and not in a very long time either. So these Bigg's killer whales, you can see here, they typically travel in the smaller groups, as you probably know, anywhere from 1 to 5 is pretty much average. And as you can tell from the top left photo there of T101, these guys do not eat fish. They like their marine mammals. So seals and sea lions making up the big portion of their diet. But they also do feed on porpoises, dolphins, and even other whales. And of course, the poster child for endangered species, the southern residents, which today we're talking, there's only 73 animals left. So, very, very small population size. Hopefully with enough conservation effort, we can see this population flourishing again, like the northern residents, who are well over 350 animals. I chose these photos here somewhat at random, except for the bottom middle one there, which is J34, or his nickname was Double Stuff. And he's the one that washed up in Seashelt there in December of 2016. And this happened shortly after some military testing that was going on in the Nunus testing range with the Gulf. They were doing air, surface, and subsurface testing. And just days after, he washed up, dying of blunt force trauma. So this kind of highlights the importance of being out there in the winter when there's not many people out there to document what's going on and where these animals are hanging out. And through OceanWise and our sightings network, we've developed an app, which some of you may use or have heard of, called Whale Report. You can download it for free, so that if you do see whales, you can plug it in through the app, and that will automatically send an alert to all the pilots in the area operating freighters, tankers, ferries, that there are whales in that location. So hopefully they can be more vigilant and take mitigating measures so we don't see something like J34 again. And then finally, the northern residents, which, like I mentioned, pretty much Campbell River North, we don't see them down here, apart from that A5 clan or the A42s, which are pictured on the bottom left there. And very similar to the southern residents in the sense that they rely heavily on salmon for their survival, but very different culturally. Typically, they don't travel in the big groups like the southern residents do. They do occasionally, but they travel more in their matriline's. And they have cultural differences, of course, like all killer whales do, different languages and dialects and behaviors. So some of the most famous videos coming out of the Sunshine Coast in the winter are, the A42s rubbing along the beach, or people standing right on the beach and seeing the whales right there rubbing on the pebbles. That's strictly a northern resident cultural behavior, and we don't see that with the other ecotypes. And another one is the top right photo there. You can see that, I don't know if you can see A126 there, that this killer whale, this youngster, he's chasing a Dall's porpoise, and it's actually the other way around. These small cetaceans like porpoises and dolphins, well, you can often find them surrounding northern resident killer whales, and the adult northern resident killer whales anyways are seemingly annoyed by it and will often dive deep to get away from them. Whereas the youngsters like A126 here will sometimes interact and play with them. It's kind of a strange behavior because the Bigg's killer whales obviously predate on these guys. So obviously the dolphins and the porpoises are able to tell the difference between the two. And we do have a paper coming up soon that discusses this further, but there's a good chance that these porpoises and dolphins will stay close to northern residents because Bigg's killer whales will typically avoid resident killer whales when they hear them. So this could be some kind of defense mechanism for these porpoises. So not just here in British Columbia, Mike Bigg inspired killer whale researchers all over the world. And as people have searched every nook and cranny of the planet, they found killer whales everywhere. And we know now that they're the most widely distributed mammal on planet Earth next to humans. Everywhere you go across the planet, from the tropics to the polar seas, you'll find killer whales. And everywhere you go, they have different foods, diets, or cultures, behaviors, languages. And even as you can see here from just some of the different ecotypes around the world, even the physical appearances can be quite dramatic, probably none quite as much as the subantarctic type D killer whale on the bottom left there. But for our intents and purposes here in the Salish Sea, we see resident killer whales and Bigg's killer whales. So that's kind of our killer whales in a nutshell. So I'm going to kind of leave them to the side and move on to the giants, which I'm sure a lot of you guys see from the shoreline there now, especially over the past about 5 to 7 years. These humpback whales, so the humpback comeback, as we call it. It's not just amazing to see them coming back, but it's been amazing to see how fast and how extreme this recovery has been. So, you know, when I say comeback, the question is, where did they go? And this image from 1907 will give you a good indication of what happened to the whales in this area. This was the same story across the whole planet. I mean, whaling was a huge industry for whale oil, and BC was no exception. There was heavy commercial whaling here until the mid 20th century, and whaling data compiled by DFO indicates that there was about 5,600 humpback whales taken in British Columbia across the 5 main whaling stations, and that was from 1905 to 1967. So after whaling was abolished in 1965, the only evidence of whaling along the coast for everybody else moving forward was just these names like Blubber Bay on Texada or Whaler Bay and Galiano, a few others here, Whaletown, Whaling Station Bay, and Bolinas. But in 1965, when the International Whaling Commission banned the whaling of humpback whales, a new chapter began for them, and this kind of slow recovery began. But we didn't see a humpback here for, up until about the mid 90s. So they were almost gone for a century. And in the mid 90s, we had this one whale show up, and you can see that's her ID image on the top left there. Her name is Big Mama, or BCY0324. And she was photographed in 97, and she's one of the first one that's been repeat photographed year after year since then. And even up until this year, she was seen just a couple weeks ago. So she's back again. And the cool thing about this photo ID, it's kind of like with the killer whales when we first started doing it. Once you get to know them as individuals, it kind of puts the story together even better and lets you get to know them a lot better as well. So for Big Mama here, we've watched her have kids and we've watched them have kids. And you can see here, there's 6 of her offspring there, and some of those have had offspring of their own. And even there, those ones have had offspring. So we've seen Big Mama's dynasty really solidified here in the Salish Sea. And hopefully that continues. And thank you to Humpback Whales of the Salish Sea project for providing this graph. I thought it was really important to share because it really shows how quick this recovery has happened. You can see Big Mama came back, and then through the early 2000s, we had a few, and then all of a sudden in 2015, it just took off, and it hasn't really stopped since. So I hope this keeps growing, but there's going to be lots of things that are going to happen to see how moving forward and how this story unfolds. We all know how busy shipping traffic is around here, and humpback whales are prone to getting hit. So this story of the resurgence of the humpbacks is certainly going to get more dramatic, I think, as the years go on. So that kind of wraps up our whales in a brief history of them anyway. I'd like to talk to you guys now a little bit about our work specifically and the work that we've done and the work that we're planning to do moving forward. So for about 10 years, our project mostly has been a project called Photogrammetry. And our team is really focused on doing whale research that's non-invasive. And drones really provided an opportunity for that. And this was developed by Dr. Lance Parrott-Leonard, Dr. Holly Fernbach, and John Durbin. And what the idea here was is to fly these drones over the same whales from year to year. As you can see from this photo here, you can see our little drone in the cloud there called Pterodactyl, flying at 30 meters above A60, who's also part of the A5 clan, and take photos of them aerially. And from that, be able to look at how fat these animals are, particularly around their head or the cranial area. It seems to be a pretty indicative area of overall health of the animals. So we have this 10-year window where we're photographing the same animals and measuring annual fluctuation in those eye patch ratios. And that way we can see how the animals are doing from year to year, but also correlate that with things like salmon abundance and seeing if that's an indication when overall health goes down in the population. One of the kind of the unintended advantages of doing this work was getting to see which animals are pregnant. Prior to that, it's very difficult to detect that from a boat, but from the air, just like us, when these females are in the late stages, they really show in their midsection. And particularly, it was a big eye opener for southern resident killer whales because, as some of you probably know, they haven't had a lot of reproductive success. And it wasn't until the drone work started that we realized it's not for a lack of trying. They were actually getting pregnant quite a bit. Lots of photos of big pregnant females, then they'd go away and they come back. They're not pregnant anymore, but they don't have a baby. So it kind of just gave more insight into the high level of lost pregnancies that the southern residents in particular are facing. And as we approached our 10-year data set for that project, we started to look at what else we could do. We wanted to move away from that project now that we have that 10 years of data and look at something else. And one idea I came up with was looking at what the whales are doing in the wintertime. If you look at the recovery strategies that DFO has put together for humpback whales, bigs, and southern residents, one of the big holes in the recovery strategy is what are these animals doing in the wintertime? And so I thought it was a perfect question to try to answer, and even more perfect to do it here in the Salish Sea because of how important this area is for southern residents and Bigg's killer whales, but also because it's such a busy area with vessel traffic as well. So that's where we started, and our project goals were essentially to document the winter habitat use and distribution of the at-risk cetacean species. And we wanted, for as far as sample collecting, we wanted to do something called environmental DNA sampling, which is kind of a relatively new field, which I'll talk to you guys a little bit about shortly. But we wanted it to test its feasibility and its effectiveness with killer whales. And then we wanted to do a short field season up on Hornby Island during the time of the herring spawn, because as a lot of you know, it is such an incredible place for marine biodiversity. So we thought it'd be a great opportunity to move up there to get samples and document that. And then opportunistic prey sampling of southern resident killer whales and humpback whales also. So for the southern residents, we wanted to basically answer two questions, like where are they going and what are they eating? As Angela mentioned, we talked in an email earlier about how the Sunshine Coast and even the whole northern Strait of Georgia is not part of critical habitat for these animals, but we're learning more and more that it definitely should be. The latter question there, what are they eating, is something that DFO has been working on for a number of years, going out and collecting samples, but due to the nature of winter work, rougher weather, shorter days, not as reliable sightings reports, it's pretty difficult. So our aim being out there already is to help complement that existing study and provide the prey samples to them so they can analyze them. Due to permitting issues, because this was our first year doing the project, we weren't able to actually get out and start to work till about February. The delay was a bit longer than expected. So we only had a few encounters with southern residents, but we were able to get a prey sample, so that was really exciting. But now with all our permits in place moving forward, we're hoping to get a much earlier start this upcoming winter, which hopefully bodes well for many more samples. And then as far as where they're going, we know that the wintertime is poorly understood, but it's not just that, it's that we're seeing that this area in the Salish Sea is becoming much more important for the southern residents in the winter now. This graph was provided to us by the Orchid Behavior Institute on San Juan Island. And you can see the 1998 to 2002 average of the southern resident killer whale presence here in the Salish Sea. That's sort of what we were more used to, which is, they're here occasionally in the winter and the fall, but mostly it was all focused around the spring and the summer, following those Chinook salmon runs to the mouth of the Fraser River. But as those populations have collapsed, these whales have kind of flipped the switch. You can see in 2022 that confirmed that dark blue line shows that they're obviously here more in the winter, but the light blue line, the speculated one, is more of an accurate picture. So what that means, speculated, is if the whales went, if the southern residents came in, they went through Active Pass and headed up towards the Sunshine Coast or Comox, and then weren't seen for another 5 days until they were seen off East Point coming down, it was speculated they just spent the last 4 or 5 days in the northern Strait of Georgia feeding. So that's more of a accurate number and kind of highlights the importance of being out there and figuring out why they're here. Then, of course, Bigg's killer whales, again, they're the new residents. So being out there to document what they're up to and who's around. I mean, it's no surprise we're seeing more and more. If you look at the numbers here, I mean, the population growth, even though it fluctuates a little bit from year and year, it's still about 3.1% on average. And as of the end of 2021, we had a population of 370 animals, but that's just the inshore population. There's also some that live on the outer coast, and it's actually a bit greater than that now as we've had some calves born into the area. But it's not just that the population is growing, but it's that new individuals are coming here as well. And this is an older graph, but it kind of shows you here in the Salish Sea how much more this habitat is being used by Bigg's killer whales, especially since the 70s. You guys might know this, in the 50s and 60s, pinnipeds like seals and sea lions were scapegoats for declining fish stocks. And as such, there was predator control programs put into place that saw a lot of them killed. And then after that, once those predator control programs were seized, those populations recovered, especially through the 80s. And the Bigg's killer whale population just recovered right along with them. And every year we've been seeing more and more unique individuals. And there are some individual families like the T49As, for example, who spend a lot of their year around the Salish Sea. But there's others like the T73As or the T167s who are more frequently seen in the winter, or the shoulder seasons as we call them. So being out there to document those more infrequent matrilines, and also to document what sort of prey they're targeting mostly in the wintertime, as most of the diet studies have been targeted in the summertime. And then humpback whales as well. I mean, a lot of you guys know these are migratory species, so the winter is not the best time to go out looking for them. But having said that, these humpbacks, as they're migrating, there's a staggered nature to their departure and their arrival. So throughout every month through the entire year, there's humpbacks reported here in the Salish Sea. So even though there's less humpbacks here in the winter, it is important to be out there to see who's here and what they're feeding on. And this has been one individual we documented this summer, or sorry, this past winter. You can see just recently returned from warmer latitudes. If you look at these kind of circular scars on his back, those are from cookie cutter sharks, which are found in warmer waters. And obviously the big prop scars, which this animal's had a negative interaction with a boat fairly recently, which is why being out there and reporting where these humpbacks are and what kind of habitat they're using is important as well. So for our winter work for this past year, like I said, this was our first year, so we were focused mostly in the Cowichan Bay. That's where we're departing from. So looking around the Southern Gulf Islands and into the Strait of Georgia. And then we moved up to Hornby Island in March during the time of the herring spawn. We're hoping this upcoming year to actually do a mini field season up on the Sunshine Coast as well to kind of complete that picture. And during the Hornby Island trip was a huge success. It was just timed perfectly with the herring spawn, and there was tons of wildlife in the area. We were able to document southern resident killer whales, Bigg's killer whales almost every day. But probably the most notable sighting we had was of this little humpback whale, the same one that I showed you a photo of a minute ago. We saw it in Lambert Channel, which is just on the inside of Hornby Island there, only in about 20 to 25 feet of water. And it wasn't long before this humpback started lunging on these huge shoals of herring getting ready to spawn, which we all know humpback whales feed on small bait fish like herring, but this is the first time it's ever been seen that a humpback whale has been feeding on herring during the time of the spawn in the Strait of Georgia. So it's going to be interesting to see how this predator-prey story unfolds, because we know humpback whales are opportunistic, but they also have culture and learn from one another. So it'll be interesting to see if this little humpback kind of starts a trend of more and more humpbacks spending time in that area. And then finally, I wanted to introduce this eDNA, or environmental DNA, that we're aiming to collect, and we have collected this past winter. So like I mentioned with the drone work, we're looking for non-invasive techniques to get information from the animals. And as far as genetic information goes, historically, it was all about using a spring-loaded dart fired from a rifle or a crossbow that takes a little bit of blubber from the animal, and then you're able to get DNA from that. So our goal with eDNA is to replace that. And just think of CSI. This is kind of what we're doing. And just like us, wherever you go, shedding skin cells, leaving genetic evidence of your presence, whales are doing the same thing. And for us, what we're looking for are these footprints or fluke prints when the animals dive. So just to kind of give you a little diagram of what it looks like, whale goes down, leaves this nice flat patch of water called a fluke print on the surface. We'll move in. You can see our field assistant, Mike Judson, there scooping some water through the fluke print. And then that water is then filtered through a clean white filter paper, which is now stained yellow, as you can see, full of DNA, which is then stored in ethanol, sent to the lab for analysis. Now, as far as the analysis goes, one of the cool things with this is the southern residents in particular, who there's only 73, so all of them have been genetically sequenced. So we have a genetic fingerprint for all of those animals, which really makes testing our methods a lot easier. So for example, our eDNA fluke print sample, this is the genetic sequence we have on the top, and then we can kind of match it up, and you can see it matches J38 cookie here. So these are still going through the analysis phase right now, so we don't have the results yet, but hopefully we have a really high matching rate, and that way we can rely on this instead of taking blubber samples from the animals. The side things that we can discover from this too are we're able to sex individuals by doing the same thing, matching up the genetic code to the male and female genetic code, like here. And then also potentially in the future is getting parentage as well. We often know who the mothers are, but we don't know who the fathers are, because typically fathers have nothing to do with raising the kids. So having this eDNA information might allow us to match up potential fathers and narrow it down that way. So just as a summary of our winter work this past year, we were able to collect 23 samples, eDNA samples from southern resident killer whales, actually just JPOD, and 16 individuals. And so that is about 2/3 of JPOD. And then we had 4 different humpback whales as well, and we were able to collect 4 eDNA samples from them, and 37 samples from Bigg's killer whales, and over 26 individuals. So that kind of sums up our winter work over this past year. And like I mentioned, we're just hoping to keep expanding that and getting more and more information. Hopefully this eDNA proves to be really, really useful. And that's it. So thank you guys so much for having me, and happy to answer any questions if you'd like.
Wow, Gary, that's so amazing, the amount of work you guys are doing. Your presentation is just so rich, and I mean, I'm really impressed with the history and the science and research and monitoring work you guys are doing. It's pretty remarkable. I got to say, I was struck by a couple things. The human impact on the southern resident killer whales and the genetic bottleneck caused by removing 50 whales from that population back in the 60s, and how it's sort of landed up where we are now. And also, the Biggs are actually residents. That's very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really neat. So the next part of the talk, we're going to do a Q&A. So I'm just going to give a little bit of an explanation for folks about how we're going to participate in this. I'm going to be taking questions from participants in two ways. If you want to ask Gary about the project or anything that he's talked about here, you can either use the raise hand function in the Zoom and wait for me to call on you, or you can post a question in the chat and I will sort of go back and forth between those two things. Zoom automatically, when you put your hand up, it automatically, lines people up in the order that you raised your hand. So for everybody, I'm just going to put myself on gallery view so that I can see everybody. We also have a couple of teaser questions if we don't have somebody jump in right away, but I encourage everybody jump in. We did say we were going to go till 1, but we can go a little bit later. We confirmed that with Gary at the beginning. So
I think Richard had his hand up there.
oh, there you go. Hi, Rick.
Hi, good day. What a wonderful presentation. Learned a lot and it was very well presented. Enjoyed all the images. So animals typically adapt very well, we know, to challenges. And of course, we're all worried about the southern residents and the decline of the Chinook population. Do you think that what's the potential that those whales will adapt to a new diet once the Chinook if they continue to decline? Is there any potential, or when the fish are gone, are they going to not be able to change change their diet?
Yeah, thanks for the compliment and the question. It's a good question, and we get that a lot. And I think it's important to remember that there are still Chinook salmon out there. So often the narrative is that these animals are starving to death, and that's not necessarily the case. It's just that they're constantly food stressed, which means they're never really having the fat stores that they need. So they're relying on their fat stores a little bit, which is a dangerous game when you're an apex predator. So Bigg's killer whales suffer from this too. Their blubber is loaded with contaminants, especially for the southern residents who live in such an urban environment. They're about 4 times more contaminated than their northern resident counterparts. So most of these toxins that they intake, like PCBs and PBDEs, which are all man-made chemicals, they're lipophilic, so they get stored in their blubber. And for a Bigg's killer whale that's nice and fat and is never in need of a meal, they kind of just stay there and stay relatively benign. But when you're a southern resident and you're constantly kind of breaking down those fat stores because you're struggling to find enough food, these toxins getting introduced in the bloodstream kind of amplify issues and can create, we don't know exactly what it's doing, but it's likely creating reproductive issues, as well as probably immune system function. Having said that, we have seen over the past few years, like that graph I showed you, the southern residents are spending a lot less time in the Salish Sea in the summer, and where they're being seen is out off Swiftsure Bank, so the western entrance to the Juan de Fuca Strait, and they're seen predating a lot on a black cod out there. That seems to be heavily what they're targeting now. So we don't know if that's always been the case, or it's just that we're looking harder now than we ever have before, especially out there. But that could potentially be an adaptation, is that they're targeting black cod a lot more than they used to.
Wow. It's interesting. It's so interesting to sort of follow it along and try to figure out what's new and what's been ongoing that we just didn't know about.
Yes, side tangent, if you don't mind, I'll go down. But the northern resident killer whales, particularly G clan, will be seen out off Swiftsure Bank as well. So there's a little bit of overlap in that range. And they also are feeding on black cod. However, this particular clan of northern residents, G clan, have learned how to depredate, which is basically a fancy word for stealing fish from fishermen. And so these longline fishermen, particularly on the US side, they as soon as the killer whales hear these drums engaged to bring up the lines with all the black cod on them, they'll come over and just steal every single fish off the line. And they're taking like 80 to 100% of the catch now.
Wow, that's huge.
Yeah.
Yay.
Yeah, they're getting fed.
Yeah.
Okay, so one of the questions that we've got, it was from Angela, is, okay, so in Misty McDuffie, who works for Rain Coast Conservation Foundation, I think, stated in the Soul of the Fraser film that the state of the southern resident killer whales was more precarious in 2022 than in 2016 when the government first introduced management measures. What are your thoughts on that evaluation?
Yeah, I think she's spot on. I think ever since these animals have been listed, even before 2016, as endangered, they're in a more of a precarious situation than they've ever been. Since we've started following them, and even prior to when we started following them, this is the most dire the population has been in, at 73 animals. It's the lowest it's ever been. So, yeah, she's not wrong, and it's extremely concerning. Hopefully, it's not too much for them to come back from, but it's teetering on that edge of functional extinction, right? Because 73 animals is sounds like a lot, but when you break it down to reproductive females, not very many. And even then, it's not much genetic diversity. So hopefully they can make it. I always like to use that famous line from Jurassic Park, life will find a way, but hopefully it does. But we need to obviously make sure they have a chance.
Yeah. And part of that is study, and other parts are, restoration of habitat for fish, I think, right?
Yeah, I think that's one of the big ones. And that's kind of what we're aiming with this winter work, is to get these winter prey samples that we can get from the animals are extremely important, because you can not only tell what type of fish it is, but they can genetically sequence it and figure out exactly what river it came from. So then we can target specific conservation efforts to restore fish populations, in particular streams and rivers that we know are going to feed the southern resident. So that's sort of the idea of getting more winter data, which has been a big hole in the data.
So until somebody else puts up their hand, I'm just going to keep asking, because I have this sort of one of the really good news stories about marine activism, I guess, and advocacy in our region over the last while that didn't necessarily seem like it was going to come to fruition is the McNabb Creek estuary is not going to now be dug up and turned into a gravel pit by Burnco out of Calgary. And that was, they had already received their environmental permits and 5 years ago, and then just through local government refusal to rezone the property there to do gravel processing. The permits died, the project was no longer economically tenable, and so we've got this Chinook-bearing stream and this estuary that desperately needs restoration. So I wonder if is some of the work that you're doing, are you guys looking at McNabb?
I'm not sure what they've looked at as far as the analysis goes for the fish, because that's all done on the DFO side of things.
Right.
So I couldn't really speak to that, unfortunately.
Too bad. It's okay, we'll follow up. So I saw Evan had his hand up and Rick's got his hand up again, but I'm going to go to Evan first.
Yeah, it's not as much of a question, but I just wanted to say that we're going to be starting a whale sightings and research group in the Upper Sunshine Coast and Desolation Sound. And if anyone here is interested in joining that, or spends time in Desolation Sound and the Upper Sunshine Coast, or knows anybody who spends lots of time there, please feel free to reach out. I'm going to put my email in the chat, and then we'll have an announcement with a poster coming up on the website a little bit later this week.
Thanks, Evan. Yeah,
Evan, will you be running that through? Would that be like a Facebook sightings group, or how are you going to do it?
We're thinking about using the BC Cetaceans app, and we're going to be working in collaboration with Simriz. They're going to help us get started. We may collaborate on the Spy Hopper platform that they run off, but we've just met with them today, so we're just kind of getting the wheels in motion. But I just wanted to put a feeler out there for anybody who's interested. And yeah, we'll be focusing on humpback whales, and kind of focusing it on the Whaletown area. We saw tons of them last summer, and not a whole lot of people watching them. So we were looking to monitor them a little bit closer.
Yeah, that'd be great. That's because that whale report app is the same as the BC Cetacean Sightings Network, so that'd be great to get that information.
Yeah, perfect.
That's great. Leanne just posted that she'll be getting in touch to see how she can contribute. Yay, that's awesome. That's sort of the whole purpose of these talks, is to really like inspire people to start taking action and to connect in. I feel like we'll be hitting you up, Gary, for
Yeah.
resources to support Evan and Sophia's emerging group.
Yeah, I'll definitely do that. I mean, like I said, especially for the winter work coming up, we'll probably be spending some time up there, and we'll be happy to contribute to that. And obviously we'll be posting on our whale report app as well.
Great. I'll look forward to it.
Awesome. Rick, did you want to go next?
Yes, thanks. Another opportunity to learn. So about, I don't know, 3 weeks ago, maybe a month ago, there was a news story that I read that came from Alaska, and a higher court in Alaska was an announcement that the higher court in Alaska had overturned the right of the government to impede the migration of Chinook salmon south. And I guess they've been doing that for a long time, and the court said not anymore. And so that was very excited to hear that, of course. And I'm wondering, you know, if those Chinook salmon are likely to migrate this far, and to help the southern resident whales. And also just a curiosity as to technically how they could have been prohibiting them from coming south. I asked, actually, I was at the salmon release at the Chapman Creek hatchery a week ago, and I asked the person who was working there, and they said, well, they would have probably been prohibiting them either through some sort of electronic or noise barrier. And but he said, you know, like some sort of screen, but he said the whales can go deep, and they probably would have been able to evade that. So I'm just curious as to what you might know about good news for our southern residents, the Chinook will come this far, and how might they have been prohibiting or, you know, impeding their progress?
As far as impeding their progress, I'm not sure how they would have done that. But whether it's good news for the southern residents or not, I mean, of course, yeah, the fish do come in, you know, when there's certain stocks anyway do come in from the Alaska and down. But one of the things for the southern residents is as these salmon stocks are declining all up and down the coast, although Alaska does a really good job of protecting their salmon in comparison to us. When they're coming through and coming up through Alaska, the first whales to get access to them are the Alaskan residents, and because there's another population of resident killer whales up there. So you have the Alaskan residents that are catching them, then they come through into northern resident killer whale territory, and they're all catching them. And then by the time they get down to the Salish Sea, you know, it used to be that there were so many fish that there was plenty for the southerns as well, but it could be an issue now that there's just not enough fish to go around for all of them. And it'll be interesting to see again how it plays out moving forward, hopefully with conservation measures that will increase the amount of salmon that are coming down for the southern residents, rather than we start to see something similar with the northern residents, which was part of our photogrammetry project, was to track body condition over time.
Thank you.
I don't want to put you on the spot, Angela, but I'm going to, because I'm curious about the avoidance measures. And I wondered if you might be able to frame a question better than me to Gary about the SKRW avoidance measures and how that's affecting the whales.
Okay. The DFO and Transport Canada have got management measures that are reviewed by the respective ministers every year. And one of the measures is to try and reduce disturbance, physical disturbance and noise disturbance for the SRKW. And so Transport Canada has announced yet again that people, regardless of whether we're in a kayak or a stand-up paddleboard or if we're in a pleasure craft, that we're supposed to stay 400 meters away from any killer whales in what they're calling southern BC, so from Campbell River down to around Wandafuka Strait, I think just somewhere close to Ucluelet, to the Brooklyn Islands. That same kind of protection isn't offered to humpbacks, humpback whales. The avoidance is only 100 years. And I can't help but think that it would be easier for the public to understand, just to be given a blanket, you know, here's the distance. If you see any whales, stay away, you know, 400 meters, if that's what the minimum has to be for the SRKW, whether that wouldn't have a benefit to the humpbacks, for example, and just make it easier for the rest of us to follow those regulations.
Yeah, it's a difficult question. I mean, it gets even more complicated because, you know, the commercial whale watching operations have been given an exemption from Transport Canada to watch Biggs at 200 meters, so as long as they don't watch southern residents at all, which pretty much every company signed on to that. So yeah, it's pretty convoluted, but I think, I guess it's just balancing, you know, whale watching companies trying to keep their businesses going, and also mitigating impacts on the whales, because 400 meters is obviously quite a distance to try to view the animals. And I think they've been obviously more lenient with humpbacks because of how well they've recovered and continue to recover. I think it should be probably 200 meters across the board, but just to make it easier. But I don't know if they'll do that or not. Yeah, I don't know how to answer it further than that. I don't know if I mean, ideally you'd want, it's easy for them to say this on paper, right? Like, okay, nobody watched southern residents within 400 meters, but you guys have all seen it from the shoreline or been on the boat yourselves. It's most people, if they see a big group of killer whales, they're within 100 meters, a lot of them. So I think having these measures put in place is one thing, but one of the big problems is enforcing them and having people out there. And for me, who spends a lot of time on the water, I very rarely see any enforcement out there, maybe once or twice. And when there is real bad behavior, there just really doesn't seem to be many consequences for it. So I think that's probably first and foremost the more important thing, rather than trying to make it further for every species, is like, let's look at what we have in place now and find a better way to enforce it so that there are more consequences for non-compliance.
The DFO does have a reporting line, the observe, record, and report line, and maybe Suzanne or Ian, maybe you could pop that link into the chat for people, so that if you happen to have your camera or even your phone and you see somebody deliberately getting closer to the whales, that they can record, you know, take a photograph. And I know in speaking to some of those enforcement officers, they actually request that if you can shoot video, that would be the best, because sometimes, as you said, you know, you come around the corner and the whale's right there, or you happen to be fishing and all of a sudden these things pop up, especially humpbacks, because they don't have those dorsal fins to warn us that they're in the area.
Yeah, totally. It's good to get as many series of photos as you can to show intention, rather than just an accidental one. And I always, I mean, to be honest, I usually give a bit more of a buffer zone around humpbacks as well, because they can be a little more oblivious than killer whales. I see people, you know, kayaking right up to them sometimes in Blackfish Sound. And I mean, I guess at times ignorance can be bliss, but these animals, they're actively feeding. And they're coming up mouths open sometimes, whether you're there or not, or they're coming up and breaching, not knowing you're there or not. And we've probably all seen videos online of whales landing on boats or close to boats. And I think giving those 40-ton animals a good buffer is a good idea.
Yeah, that was one of our conversations earlier in the week about, making it mean something to the humans about, how the getting too close to the whales can actually hurt you too, not just them, because sometimes that's the motivation that the humans need
Yeah.
to help look out for the other creatures. Yeah.
I should say though, I mean, going back to that question about the vessel impacts, it's like with humpbacks, obviously the ship strikes are a big one for them. With the residents, I guess that there are acoustic studies that are being done, but it's really funny with the Bigg's killer whales. They seem at times totally unfazed. I've seen maybe a handful of occasions where there's been really bad behavior, like aggressively chasing at high speed, that they just disappear on you. Biggs are pretty good at that when they want to. But other times, like a couple of days ago, they just came. It was a Saturday afternoon in Cowichan Bay Marina, and this group of 9 Bigg's killer whales came right into the marina, right to basically the boat launch amongst all the moored boats, and started killing a seal. And there were, I mean, every boat and kayaker and paddleboarder was just right there, and these whales are still thrashing the seal, breaching around and doing their thing. They just seem so confident and totally unfazed. So yeah, that's my 2 cents on the Biggs anyway.
You're making me want to ask about one of the things in your presentation that I saw that was so clear too is the fact that once we started taking, not just killing all the seals and the sea lions, that the orcas started doing better. And so there's a contentious proposal to build an LNG facility in Howe Sound, and we've been going through this process where the company is Woodfibre, and Woodfibre's got an environmental permit to build this facility, and they had previously, and Angela, if I get the numbers wrong, jump in and correct me, but I think the original permit allowed them to pound those piles and make that horrible racket. I think it was 7 kilometers away from the stellar sea lions and the other pinnipeds, because the noise is so loud that it literally deafens the seals and then causes all kinds of stuff and mortality. And now the company is coming back and asking for an amendment to their permit to be able to do that work within 125 meters.
That's for the pinnipeds.
For the pinnipeds, not for the whales.
Yeah, cetaceans they keep it at it was over 7,000, over 7,000 meters, and now they're asking for an amendment to that environmental condition. So down to, I think they actually had asked for something slightly less, and it negotiated up to about 125 meters, given a certain sound, right? So they felt that distance with that particular sound, that there would not be any noise damage resulting in death. But there seemed to be, and they didn't provide any data, any scientific data, that there wouldn't be temporary hearing loss, for example, in the pinnipeds that if they came by.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? I mean, it's like Authentic Island down off Race Rocks there, which is a huge pinniped area, elephant seals, sea lions, and there's a big live weapon testing facility right there in Esquimalt that come out and detonate live ammunition in that area, and I've heard it from the boat sometimes. It's loud, it's really loud, and the pinnipeds are right there. I mean, I guess it's progress somewhat, considering 1960s or whatever, they were flying above entire colonies and blowing them up. So I mean, that's better than that, I suppose. But yeah, it's hard to manage this kind of constant dream of consistent economic growth, and also, having a vibrant marine environment. Yeah, it's the takeaway from most of the conversations that we have these days. And then the how can we help is sort of the accumulation at the end, where we go, okay, there's all of this Roberts Bank, the Woodfibre, all of these different things. So tangible ways that we can take action. We've got a whole bunch of links Ian's been posting into the chat as we've been going along.
And that we'll share as well with anybody who's participated today. But some of the stuff on my list was there's an avoidance infographic, which is a really good one so that people can see, you know, how, like, you know, what are the rules and how far away from the whales are we supposed to stay? Shared around. You talked about the Whale Report website, Gary, and the Whale Report app.
Yes.
So those are
Yeah.
those are two really important resources I think we'll share. And then there was one thing that you talked about. You said the Fin Wave website. Is that right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So that's going to be finwave.io.
Okay.
It's not live yet, but it will. It's just going through beta testing right now, and hopefully will be launched in the next month or so. So, like I mentioned, it's going to be basically the entire Bigg's killer whale database on this platform, which has always been sort of an internal DFO information, but now it's going to be publicly available for people not only to see but to also contribute to, and get to see all kinds of cool information about the unique individual Bigg's killer whales. It's going to be pretty neat. It's kind of, have you guys ever heard of Happy Whale? It's Happy Whale is something similar, but it's designed for humpback whales. So essentially what they have is they have a, you take a photo of a humpback whale's fluke, you put it onto the website, load it up, and they have AI software that will go through and try to match it to other catalogs. And then you'll get an email saying, hey, your whale was matched to this. And then again, if your whale is seen by somebody else who takes a photo, like for example, I've taken photos of humpbacks here, posted them, and then someone in Hawaii who's guiding a tour takes a photo and it matches, it'll send you an email saying, hey, your whale Big Mama was seen in Hawaii on, you know, January 26th. And
Cool.
so basically we're building the same thing, but for killer whales.
Very cool. Very cool. Thank you so much for all of your work. I think unless anybody has any more questions for Gary, doesn't seem so. I think we're going to just sort of wrap it up. And thank you again so much, Gary, for your amazing presentation, for joining us, and for all the good work you're doing. And to everybody in the gallery, we really hope that you will check out the rest of our program for our World Oceans Day Festival this year. Ian's going to post all the links into the chat. I would be remiss if I didn't say thanks to our sponsors, the District of Sechelt, Sunshine Coast Regional District, and the Credit Union for supporting the festival, and also to Diane and Angela, who are amazing World Oceans Day Working Group stalwarts who've been helping us with this project forever and who have connected us with folks like Gary and others. And to Billy Carroll and Rhizome Up Media and the Green Film Series, who are the driving force behind creating the festival program with all the videos and all the supporting resources on the website. And I think, yeah, Ian's just loading up the chat with all the different links to the rest of the program. So we've got an amazing event coming up on Thursday, Uncharted Waters, as a film made by an amazing group of folks in Howe Sound about some of the really successful conservation work that's happening there. It's going to be a celebration with food. And what else do we have? Nemo talks every day this week. Tomorrow's talk is, oh my gosh, I'm going to forget. Will Dogood. The subject is forage fish and the Chinook salmon connection. So it's a perfect follow on from Gary's talk today. So we hope to see everybody at the festival, and thank you. Thank you so much for all you do, and have a great day.
Thank you guys. Thanks for having me, and keep up the great work.
Thank you.